Where Werewolves Come From by Scott LaFave. It is not simply against future conspiracies of evil men which we have to guard ourselves, but it is against ourselves, against our weaknesses and faults in our own social order, and our own ways of living against which we have to be on continual guard. Donald Ewan Cameron. Chapter 1. Fireworks. The best part of the fireworks display should be the finale, she said, and turned over to fumble around in her cigarette pack, perched precariously half off the edge of the bedside table. He said, "I'm sorry. This usually doesn't happen like this." And she declined to respond to his response, and clicked her lighter until the flame caught and lit her face up briefly as she inhaled and the tip of her cigarette caught fire. "It's okay," she said, and exhaled smoke, but he could tell it wasn't okay. It's just something people say when they don't know what else to say. He laid on his back with his arms crossed behind his head and stared at the ceiling in the late night half-light, and thought about fireworks, and remembered the end of the 4th of July fireworks, after the demolition derby at the Speedway the next county over. After all of the thoroughly demolished vehicles were towed away from the track, the fireworks were lit, and the redneck racetrack rats would scurry around extinguishing the fires ignited in the infield grass by stomping on them, and he always wondered what it would be like to watch one of them get hit by the white-hot sparks descending from the sky and catch fire and run around like a human flame trying to extinguish his burning hair by punching himself in the head over and over again. It never happened. They used to sell severed rabbit feet at the souvenir stand. They were available dyed in all the primary and secondary colors, and some in between, and they came capped with a shiny metal cap made of gold or silver-looking metal, crimped around the amputated end of the severed limb, and a short beaded keychain. Each summer he'd buy a rabbit's foot for good luck, and carried it around in his pocket as a lucky charm on his keychain until he lost his keys, which happened at least once a year. And he'd have to get a new set of keys made from the spare set his father kept on a hook in the garage, especially designed as the master set of keys that each new set would be duped from after he inevitably lost them. And each summer he'd buy another rabbit's foot, until the summer before he turned 13, when he finally realized he didn't need to have a rabbit's foot, and that it really wasn't doing much to bring him any noticeable upturn in his fortunes. Coincidentally, that was the same year that he stopped losing his keys. He never thought about what happened to the rest of the rabbit when they took the rabbit's feet. He realized that maybe rabbit's feet aren't that lucky if having 4 of them meant that you would be bred in cages and slaughtered by rednecks so that your feet would be cut off and dyed in all of the colors of the rainbow and sold to other rednecks at a race car track for less than $1 a foot. She inhaled and said, "What are you thinking about?" and exhaled a plume of blue-gray smoke toward the ceiling fan which was spinning slowly around and around above them. "I don't know. Nothing. I think I'm going to go," he said, and he sat up and swung his legs over the edge of the bed, placing his feet on the floor, and as he shifted his weight to get on his feet, she contemplated reaching out and touching him on his naked back and asking him not to go, by telling him that it was all right, and that it always would be all right, and that he didn't have to go. But instead she turned away and extended her arm and ashed her cigarette into the empty can of soda sitting on the corner of the bedside table, and as the hot ash hit the small amount of soda left in the bottom of the can that you can never seem to sip hard enough to get, it made a hiss as it extinguished, and she sighed to herself as he bent over to put on his shoes. Chapter 2. Bottle Rockets. It was the summertime, and it was hot, but it wasn't so much hot as it was humid, which it always was in the summer, except in the evenings, after it rained, and even then sometimes you'd stick to the sheets, unaffected by the cool night breeze. It was the 3rd of July, because everyone has the 4th of July off work, so the people that lived on or near the coast planned their bonfires and revelry for the night before the holiday, so they could drink to excess and spend the next day sleeping it off, and dealing with the consequences of the night before. They went together, but they weren't together, and it made it awkward when he introduced her to the people that he knew. They spent a lot of time together in her apartment in the basement, watching movies on her futon which doubled as a couch and a bed, but he never had the chance to see it as a bed, because he was always politely ushered out while the bed was still a couch, and before she performed her evening routine of removing her makeup and washing her face, which always left it more luminous than it was before. When they were watching movies, he would often think about reaching across the distance politely mutually left between them and touching her somewhere in the hope that touching her would inspire a passionate response. And maybe when they were sitting in the darkened basement, illuminated by the blue-white light of the television, she hoped that he would muster the courage to lean across the void that separated them, and maybe she wanted to be touched, but maybe she didn't, and he had no way of knowing, and it always complicates things, even when you agree in advance that you won't let things get complicated, and you tell yourselves that you're both adults and that you can handle this, except when you are finally old enough and have control of your emotions enough, and are responsible for your actions and the results of your actions enough, that you are an adult and you can handle it, and even then things are always more awkward after than before. They always are. But he never did, and she never did, and whatever unspoken thoughts they were thinking they dealt with on their own terms, on their own time, and he would watch the moon through the moon roof, which seemed to race across the sky on clear nights on the ride home, and wax romantically, breathing deeply, filling himself with the cool night air, imagining what their first kiss might feel like, and imagining how soft a clenched fistful of her hair would feel. And she would wince when she applied the astringent, and wonder if he was thinking the same thing that she was thinking, and that maybe someday she would sit a little closer to him on the couch, and maybe she would lean over and rest her head on his shoulder, and they could sit in the darkness, both acknowledging the fact that they were touching each other alone in the darkness. But then she'd splash cool water on her face and sigh, and dry her face with a conveniently placed face towel, and fold it in half, then half again, and place it on the towel rod to dry, turn away from the mirror, and walk out of the bathroom, making sure to turn off the bathroom light, causing the little night light plugged into the outlet to turn itself on and glow in the shape of a crescent moon. He brought a case of Coronas, not because he planned on drinking a case of Coronas, but because it seemed the hospitable thing to do in response to being invited to the 3rd of July events. He knew there would be several people in attendance, and some may not have adequately prepared for the amount of drinking that they were going to attempt, and he wanted to help the events of the evening progress if he could, and bringing more alcohol than he planned on consuming seemed like as good a way as any to accomplish this goal. They were greeted and introduced, and vain attempts to memorize names were attempted, and in exchange for his offering he was offered bottle rockets, of which he took one. Exhilarated by the sense of impending adventure, he took out his lighter and lit the fuse, pinching the end of the stick between his thumb and index finger at the end of his outstretched arm. In his imagination it would be a grand gesture. He thought that it would seem magical, like a magic missile, or a tiny comet flying upward from his hands into the night sky. A spectacular feat accomplished with the assistance of cut-rate pyrotechnics. The incendiary ignited surprisingly quickly, and startled by the sparks, he released the pressure he was applying with his fingers, and the firework shot off and did a 360 turn in midair and shot directly into her chest, hitting her in her exposed neckline about an inch above the seam, and bounced off and rocketed down the street, exploding on the ground with a weak popping sound. There was a second of silence, and then they erupted in laughter, and he made sure that she was all right, and upon inspection the bottle rocket had left a little mark, a tiny crescent-shaped burn that would take a little while to heal, and would, in time, fade away into forgotten memory. They drank the Coronas, which were warming up in the evening air, and they talked about the weather, and music, and movies, but they didn't talk about each other and the distance between. Everyone forgot about the bonfire at the beach, because last year there was a stabbing, and by the time everyone was ready to go to the beach, people were coming out of the woods at the edges of the property line saying that the cops had showed up and instructed everyone to leave immediately, or there would be arrests made, and it seemed ill-advised to remain when the authorities were exerting the influence of their authority. So everyone left, heading towards the shelter and concealment of the relative darkness of the tree line. It was quiet on the ride home, each of them traveling inside of their own minds, and when they arrived at her house he didn't stop the car, and she got out and said good night and closed the door behind her. She was wounded, and he was embarrassed, but neither was a mortal wound, and they both went on to live their lives in their own way, but not together, and the next time each of them felt like calling each other, they second-guessed their initial impulse. Chapter 3. Witchcraft. The worst part about being a witch was always having to explain herself, she thought absent-mindedly, as the woman that was talking at her continued to make uninteresting noises with her mouth. She wore a pentagram necklace and had a tattoo of the moon cycle on the back of her neck. She often wore black, although not exclusively. But if you looked in her closet, it looked like a study in black with a slight detour into the grayscale, on the outside edges ending in something singularly white. When asked why she wore black, she was usually at a loss for an explanation, but when she thought about it, when she was alone and had time for reflection, she thought it was because she liked the way the color black contrasted with the whiteness of her skin. She abhorred the sun, but not because it was bright, but because it was often too warm, and when it shone on her skin it made her feel uncomfortably aware that her skin was her outside boundary, and that it was alive and living as if it had its own existence, and her consciousness was just a passenger in this flesh and blood machine that she had a certain somewhat connected control of. At night, sometimes she'd lay awake and listen for the sound of her pulse as her heart pumped her blood through her ear canals, and she'd imagine her blood as a warm red river flowing through her body, returning to her heart, which she imagined as a cavernous, muscular machine, and being pumped back around, her breaths acting as the bellows that powered the whole wet contraption as her chest rose and fell, expanding and contracting her torso. She didn't believe in spells. She didn't have a cauldron or a black cat, but she did have an altar of sorts. A small black three-legged table that sat in the corner of her favorite room. It was just under waist height, and she would often kneel and sit on her feet when she sat before it and performed her unique manner of worship. Sometimes she'd do so until her feet went numb, and when she stood up her feet were shot with pins and needles as the blood rushed back into her collapsed capillaries, but she didn't mind the pain because it reminded her that she was alive. On the altar was a decorative kerchief, midnight blue with gold stars and moons scattershot across it. On top of the cloth was a silver picture frame with a picture of her mother in it. She had traced the outside of the picture frame with lavender oil because her mother had always loved the smell of lavender. She had always loved her mother. Her mother was dead. It was cancer. Her mother went into work one day and told her coworker she wasn't feeling well. When she went to the hospital, the doctors told her she was infested with cancer and that the condition was inoperable. That night she fell into a coma, and 2 days later she was dead. She went quietly, calmly, without any awareness of her passing, and there was at least that to be thankful for, but the pain of the loss was keen and constant, as if her daughter had lost a part of herself, and the lost limb was constantly itching, but unable to be scratched. The picture in the frame was her daughter's way to let her mother know that she would never forget about her. That was the summer that she realized there wasn't a God. She knew this intuitively because if there was a benevolent higher power that had their hands on the wheel of the world, that he would not, in good conscience, take from the world a woman who had not intentionally offended anyone in her time on this earth. She struggled with herself, unraveling her conception of life and death and the afterlife, and was on the verge of deciding that there was no enduring existence of the consciousness after the corruption of the mortal form, but she had precognitive dreams. It wasn't anything like knowing what the lottery numbers were, or knowing that there was going to be a terrible accident, or hearing the voices of ghosts or seeing apparitions appearing, emerging from thin air, and gesturing meaningfully towards hidden treasure. It was all too common phenomenon. Sometimes she would be listening to someone and she would know a moment before it happened what the person would say or a gesture that they would perform, and in her mind this was her way of knowing that she was where she was supposed to be in the world, and on her life's path, whatever that meant. It was disconcerting because, with the exception of that particular phenomenon, she was willing to write off the existence of anything paranormal or spiritual, but her precognitive dreams continued despite her natural inclination towards a certain stubborn skepticism, and she practiced magic. It wasn't as if she had a garden tending monkshood and wolfsbane and morning glory and mandrake root with the intention of harvesting them to grind up with a mortar and pestle to put together potions to use to try to change the world around her. But she did have a stick of cinnamon on her altar, and a sprig of lavender and a dried red rose that she had been given on a Valentine's Day years ago, although the gesture was better remembered than the suitor. The rose was still here, while he was long gone. Dating was difficult since she was trying to create and control the world according to her particular perspective. The influence of others was often distracting, and although she always acknowledged the admiration of those that admired her, she would rarely pursue the prey or allow herself to be pursued. Life was simpler, and when the heat and pressure of sexual desire welled up within her, she found that she was equally as able to satisfy the compulsion as any suitor was able to, if not better, because she knew what she liked and there wasn't any need for embarrassingly sticky fumblings in darkened rooms trying to maneuver one's way around a maze of apparel and trying to manually manipulate the foreign territory of another person's body. She liked living alone, and she didn't understand how people were lonely without the company of others. She had an active imagination, and on sleepless nights would spend hours laying on her back, looking up at the ceiling of her room in the dark, exploring the labyrinthine passages of her mind, and amusing herself with the way that her mind seemed to work on its own, deciding which way it would turn like an unpredictable animal, warm in its warren, taking her along as a passenger as it synthesized experience from previous experiences. Sometimes she would burn incense at her altar, and she would stare into the smoke and slow her breathing down and try to lose herself in the contact with her fretful animated body and its consistent communication that it did indeed exist. She would stare into the smoke and try to see if she could see something in the smoke that would inspire a revelation or at least some sort of expansive insight, but it never worked. Although it was always calming and helped her to find her center, and she felt that after those exercises she found herself to be more herself, although she'd find it difficult to explain it to anyone else if they asked. She has a crystal ball. It wasn't crystal, but it was clear glass and sat atop a black velvet cloth on a decorative silver metal stand. And she tried staring into it to lose herself, but she always found herself more fascinated with the way that the minuscule lights in her room were captured and reflected within the curvature of the ball, but she kept the ball on her altar because it seemed like the proper place to keep it. She had read books on witches and witchcraft and spellcraft and magic, and she found them fascinating reading, but of little practical use. She felt no compulsion to stand in the middle of a field in the dark, lit only by the light of a full moon, and chant incantations to try to effect a possible future for herself. Instead, she felt that she was better served helping herself, and that in the absence of her mother that the world was a mean and generally selfish place that didn't really care whether anyone lived or died. If she could kill a mosquito with a slap of her hand, and deer were regularly destroyed by trucks, then cancer could kill her at any time it wanted. And closing your eyes and thinking real hard and wishing that the imaginary man that lived in the sky would hear your thoughts and would think and, in a blink, would change the world to make things go your way was simple, and she couldn't, in good conscience, throw in with anyone that believed in the power of prayer. But there were still the dreams, and she was still predisposed to wearing black, and she didn't like the way that the sun felt on her skin, and she liked the way that her silver necklace of a five-sided star within a circle, hanging from a soft black cord, rested in the center of her breastbone with its comforting weight. And when she encountered a Christian, she listened patiently to their petitions, all the while knowing in her heart of hearts that what she knew was true. And she felt no need to justify herself when shone upon by the spotlight of the judgmental gaze of another. She knew in her heart that she was who she was, and that if someone wanted to call her a witch, to be able to comfortably incorporate her into their worldview, then she would let them think that she was a witch, but that she would not endeavor to explain herself to anyone any more. Chapter 4. God. She believed in Jesus. She believed in God. She liked to imagine that everything happened for a reason and that there was a benevolent hand upon the metaphorical wheel. She went to church, and when she closed her eyes and listened to the words of the man at the altar reverberate around inside the open architecture of the church, she felt at home inside herself. She knew that the words in the book weren't magic spells that could conjure up the All-Father, but she felt that when she closed her eyes and prayed, that her entire self became a beam of light shining from her center, and that the beam of light shot out into space, and that the beam connected to God, wherever and whatever he was, and that he acknowledged her existence, and that he knew what he was doing, and that everything would be all right. But that didn't keep her father from taking an unhealthy interest in her at a young age. But she always wondered why it felt uncomfortable kissing her father on the mouth. It wasn't just that his mustache tickled, it was something else, something that she couldn't put into words, and that she only knew intuitively that even if it was socially accepted, it wasn't something that made her feel comfortable. She always wondered how all of the other little girls could climb all over their fathers as if they were human jungle gyms and sit on their father's knees and be bounced up and down, and make it look as natural as the sunshine on a warm summer's day. Her mother was generally emotionally unavailable. She was always present, but disengaged like a television turned off in the corner of the room. She would move of her own volition and maintained herself of her own accord, but if her mother ever had any interest, she was unaware of them. She knew that her mother liked tea with cream and sugar, and disliked cats and dogs and most other animals, but the rest of the details regarding her mother's existence faded into the background of her memory, like the wallpaper pattern of a room that one spends too much time in. Her father liked camping, and he would take her with him. In the back of her mind, she thought that maybe he secretly wanted a son. He would take her fishing. They would get into the boat, and he would row them out into the middle of the lake, and he would have a net bag that he would keep a six-pack of beer in and hang it off of the side of the boat so it waded in the water, so the water would keep it cool, and he would sip from the can while the boat rocked soothingly side to side, and when they caught fish he would clean them, and he always took the time to show her how to clean them properly, but he never made her clean them, satisfied with the lesson alone. They would stack stones in a circle and gather twigs and cut down the dead branches that they had gathered to a manageable length. And they would build a fire, and if they didn't catch any fish, they would jam hot dogs onto the ends of sticks and roast them over the fire until the outsides were blackened and burst open, and the insides were hot and a deep rich pink. And when they had eaten their fill of hot dogs, they would roast marshmallows until the outsides were dark brown or black, and the insides were melted, and sometimes they would catch fire and fall off the sticks into the fire. But that was okay, because there were always more to be found in the bag. They wouldn't set up a tent because the bugs were usually attracted to the embers of the fire, and although she had her own sleeping bag, she would usually sleep with him in his because she would get cold during the night, and her father pushed off heat like a wood fire stove, and she liked the feeling of being safe within the circle of his arms. In the mornings he would wander off into the woods to make water in the morning, and although he always turned his back to her, she could hear the splashing sound of the urine splashing into the leaves, and hear his sigh of relief coming up from a deep place inside of him. She was only a child, and she didn't think it unusual, and she spent a lot of time by herself inside her head. She liked to read, and her favorite book was Black Beauty, because she loved the idea of horses and always wanted a horse, but a horse that she could talk to like it was her friend, so that she could comb its coat and feed it apples and tell it secrets. But when she grew older, she realized that horses can't talk, and that she didn't have a lot of secrets to share anyway. She did well in school, but in an unspectacular manner. She was bookish and quiet, and being so made the other children regard her with a certain suspicion, as if she was an alien or from a different species that liked reading books and didn't get excited when it was time for recess, and didn't want to jump rope or wear red ribbons in her hair. The other girls were friendly as can be expected, knowing that girls can be catty and children can be cruel. But she wasn't invited to the birthday parties of the other girls, and she only received cards on the major holidays from the other children, because it was considered common courtesy to do so, and to intentionally disinclude anyone would be impolite. She received a scholarship to a Christian college, with relatively little ceremony, and when she went away, her mother and father dropped her off at the train station with a rolling luggage rack, with most of her worldly possessions inside rolling behind her. When she paused to look behind her, her mother was staring ahead, through the windshield impassively, and her father was doing the same, except that there were 2 tracks of tears glistening in the channels running down the front of his face, although she could only see the left side of his face since he was staring straight ahead, and when she raised her hand to wave goodbye, he drove away without a sign of acknowledging her farewell. She was in class when the dean of students came in, and asked for her by name, and asked her to come out into the hallway, where he informed her of what had happened. Her father had hanged himself from the rafters of the garage, and her mother was found sitting at the kitchen table with an empty cup of tea in front of her, sitting in a pool of her own waste, cold and dead, staring ahead impassively out of the kitchen window into the backyard, as was her habit. The only reason anyone knew anything was amiss was that the paper boy noticed a pile of papers accruing on the doorstep and decided to try to walk around the house to see if he could see inside, to discover if the tenants had moved without informing him. And when he ran around the side of the garage, he peered inside to see if there was a car inside, and there was, but there was also a pair of feet hanging mid-air, with the right shoe on and the left shoe off. She took the news with surprising calmness, and assured the dean of students that she would be all right and return to class as if nothing had happened. She knew that her mother and father would be all right in heaven with God, and the souls of all of her ancestors, and although she had trouble imagining what heaven was like, she imagined her parents continuing to exist in their happiest moments from her memory, her mother sipping tea and looking out of the kitchen window into the backyard as the early morning sunlight shone in, making square patterns on the linoleum, and her father with a cool beer with drops of condensation dripping down the side in one hand and a fishing rod in the other, quietly sipping as the boat rocked gently back and forth to the rhythm of the current of the lake. She became active in the Christian Coalition, which is what the campus Christian Activities Club called itself, and although it was pleasant to find a group of people that had the same beliefs as she did, she found that the intentions of most of the male members of the group were less than pious, and that in essence it served as a Christian singles club, and that after a few meetings she stopped attending the meetings, deciding instead to keep her own company, and make her own peace between herself and her God. She woke up one morning, and she knew it was the last day. She could clearly hear the voice of God telling her that although the world was not going to end, her role within the world was over, and that it was okay for her to go to heaven and meet him personally. She knew this with the same kind of certainty that she was alive, and that the skin she was in was her own. She walked to the gas station and bought a 5-gallon container for gas, and she filled it up with 5 gallons of gas, and bought a small pink plastic lighter from the display of multicolored lighters on the counter at the gas station. She rode her bicycle to the lake, with a gas can in the basket mounted to the front of it, in front of the handlebars, and carried the red plastic container with her to the dock, where she untied the boat and rowed it out to the center of the lake. She undid the stopper for the can of gas and lifted it over her head and poured the gas inside on top of her head, and it ran down her side, soaking her clothes and pooling in the bottom of the boat. It was difficult to breathe, and the fumes from the gas stung her eyes, but with her eyes closed, she reached into her pocket and took out the little pink plastic lighter, and pressed her thumb against the ridged metal wheel, with the flint lining the center of it, and moved her thumb towards herself. The flint made a scratching sound as it scratched against the steel, but the lighter failed to ignite. She took a deep breath, but the fumes from the gas stung her sinuses, and she sputtered but made a concerted effort to press down harder on the child-protective hood of silver-chromed metal arcing over the flint-lined wheel, and when she dragged her thumb toward her, the flint sparked the steel and ignited the thin stream of butane that was released by depressing the flipper in front of the lighter, and it ignited the gas that she had poured all over herself, and she burst into flames. And as she burned, she was happy, even though it hurt, because she imagined herself as a solid beam of light projecting from the center of herself into space, and that the beam connected to God, wherever and whatever he was, and that he acknowledged her existence and smiled down at her, and that he knew what he was doing, and that everything would be all right. Chapter 5. I was on fire when they found me. He was on fire when they finally got to him. He hit the wall going around 200. He was getting ready to press the brake a little, to ease the speed down a little, to take the turn, and when he missed the brake with his foot, he accidentally hit the gas, and harder than he intended to, since he was trying to hit the brake, harder than he would have if he succeeded in hitting the brake the first time around, and he hit the reinforced barrier wall going full speed. The inside of the car had been reinforced with a precision custom-bent roll cage, and the firewall plates were all installed where they were supposed to be, and the driver's harness absorbed most of the energy of the impact and prevented the driver from being snapped in half and having his top half propelled through the windshield into the reinforced barrier wall at slightly less than 200 miles an hour. But the impact ruptured the fuel tank, and the hot fuel shot into the interior of the car. The fuel inside the gas tank was 110 octane, and it blew up like a bomb, flashing fire throughout the inside of the car, and what was flammable caught fire, and what was inflammable also caught fire, but what was non-flammable did not. Thankfully, the helmet was fireproof, and the jumpsuit and the gloves and the shoes he was wearing were fire-resistant, but the spaces in between the suit and his gloves and shoes, where his wrists and ankles were not fireproof nor particularly fire-resistant, and the flesh around his wrists and ankles was cooked through to the bone almost instantaneously. The track medics reached him as fast as humanly possible, and doused him in the car with fire-suppressing foam that immediately extinguished the flames, and they ripped open the net and pulled him out of the car and threw him onto a stretcher as gently as the urgency of the situation would allow, and they rushed him into the waiting ambulance, which then rushed him to the hospital, but the damage had already been done. His pulmonary system had been saved the trauma of inhaling the caustic smoke from the combustion of the interior of the car by the design of his helmet, but the shock of the impact and the pain of the incineration of the exposed parts of his body caused him to weave in and out of consciousness as the painkillers killed the pain and his body recuperated from the trauma that he had inadvertently inflicted upon it as a consequence of his profession. When he came to, he wasn't able to move his arms, as they had been gently but securely secured to the sides of the bed. He called out, and when a nurse arrived in response to his cries for help, she immediately left to summon a doctor, and when she returned with the doctor, they ignored his shouted questions as they informed him that they were going to give him a sedative to help to calm him down, as the shock of having to deal with all of the consequences of his crash would be an unnecessarily extreme shock to his already considerably weakened system. When the world was softened around the edges by the warm embrace of the sedatives, they told him what he needed to be told. Over the next few days, he learned that his hands and feet had been removed, since the burns on his wrists and ankles had been so extreme that they had been cooked through to the bone for the breadth of the inch-wide areas that were exposed to the burning fuel, and that anything on the other end of the burns, on the other side away from the heart, had died, and being dead they swelled up, blackened and plump like hot dogs cooked over a campfire, and had been removed as a precautionary measure to prevent the resulting infection from spreading throughout his system, which would have surely killed him. "Why didn't you just let me die?" he asked sincerely. "Preserving life is the primary goal of our profession," the doctor replied, equally sincere. In the resulting silence you could hear the vertical blinds click and clatter against each other as they were pushed around by the room's air conditioning. They gave him prosthetic hands and prosthetic feet, and although they were intended to take the place of the missing members, they were poor replacements. He managed to walk with the assistance of crutches, which were specially adapted with foam-padded cups to rest the stumps of his amputated hands in, while the cuffs of the crutches were strapped around his forearms, and artificial feet which had foam-padded cups for him to rest the amputated stumps of his legs in, while the spine of the prosthetic feet were strapped to the bottoms of his legs. But although the amputated stumps had been cauterized, theoretically killing the sensations in the nerve endings of his amputated extremities, it was always uncomfortable, and there was a lingering dull ache, and he would never again walk well, as most people underestimate the role that the bones and musculature of the feet play in the seemingly simple process of bipedal locomotion. Although it was possible, in theory, for him to drive, if he was so predisposed, and was to have a custom-equipped vehicle that was equipped with mechanisms that would accommodate his missing extremities, he was not so predisposed, figuring that the amputation of his hands and feet was as close a warning shot as God was liable to give him regarding his involvement with motor vehicles, and he was happy enough spending most of his time at home inside watching car races on television or staggering outside and down to the local park to sit on a bench soaking in the sunshine and watching the birds fly and the squirrels scurry and the people walk their dogs and try to avoid the impulse to do a double take when they saw the man with the fake hands and feet sitting on the bright green painted bench by the lake. He had a nurse that visited him once a week to help him take care of what needed taken care of, and to make sure that he was still alive and well, or as well as he could be considering. The nurse was a male nurse, and when the agency asked him if he had any objections to having a male nurse, he said that he had no objections, as he had a pretty clear idea of what the nurse's responsibilities were, and he was fairly certain that the nurse's gender would have relatively little impact on their ability to perform their duties. In time they grew accustomed to one another, and they allowed each other certain liberties. The man's food stamps could not be used to purchase cigarettes or alcohol, but the nurse sold the man's painkillers to his fellow nurses at the agency and bought the man cigarettes and alcohol with the well-intentioned permission of the man and a small percentage of the profit. The man figured that the painkillers did little to handle the constant dull ache other than make him feel drunk, and if he were to feel drunk he would prefer to do so the honest way. So when the nurse would come by each week he would have a carton of Marlboro cigarettes, a carton of Camel cigarettes, a handle of Jack Daniels, and a handle of Southern Comfort, as the man, considering himself to be a true patriotic American, preferred domestic cigarettes and whiskey, but also liked a little bit of variety in his life. The nurse would sit with the man and they would sip whiskey and smoke cigarettes, and play chess while watching the race cars go around in circles on television, and sometimes the nurse won the game of chess, and sometimes the man did, but each thought that the other one would let them win when they won out of polite consideration. But the truth of the matter was that they were fairly well matched when it came to the game of chess. At the end of the allotted time the nurse would leave, and they would agree to meet at the same time the following week. One week when the whiskey had gotten the better of him, the nurse looked up at the man, who was seriously contemplating the chess pieces, plotting his next series of moves, and when the man looked up and met his gaze, the nurse took a breath and said, "Do you ever miss them?" "What, my hands and feet?" the man replied. "Yeah," the nurse said, and hoped he hadn't overstepped the boundaries of polite conversation. "I was on fire when they found me," he said, "and I'm lucky to be alive. My wrists and ankles had been cooked clean through to the bone, and even if they had let me keep them, they would have rotted off and killed me to boot. I may not have my hands and feet anymore, but I'll never have to work another day in my life. My needs are simple, and I find what companionship I need between your visits and watching people and animals at the park with the lake when the weather is fair. I miss the smell of a woman, but I've had my fair share and more in my time, and there's more to life than sex. I've still got my memories and an active enough imagination that I don't feel like I've missed out on that much, all things considered, and all cats are gray in the dark. I may never be able to run again, and swimming is pretty much out of the question unless I want to drown. But I was on fire when they found me, and not many people will ever have the right to say that sentence while telling the truth, and I will always have that no matter what. Everyone else can have their hands and feet for all I care. I have what I have, and that's enough for me. Life isn't fair, but it does have a sense of humor." Then the man took a drag from his cigarette, took a sip from his glass of whiskey on the rocks, exhaled a plume of blue-gray smoke that swirled the cloud of smoke that hung under the unadorned bulb hanging in the overhead lighting fixture, moved one of his pawns forward 2 squares and said, "Your move." Chapter 6. Zebras. She was born with a birthmark across her face like a burn mark, a deep scarlet mark that played across her face like a crippled hand with its fingers splayed. It was as if she fell asleep in the detention after school one afternoon with her left eyebrow pressed against a map of Australia, drawn in magenta in reverse, with her left eyebrow resting on Tennant Creek in the Northern Territory, with the Philippines and New Zealand flicked in, one on each side for good measure, and the map was permanently impressed onto her skin. She used to be afraid of the sun. She used to wear a thick layer of foundation, applying an artificial pallor to conceal the strawberry stain. Covering her birthmark with a thick layer of foundation caused her skin to break out in acne, which caused her to try to cover up the blemishes up with more makeup. a vicious circularity that she couldn't seem to find a way around. Sometimes it's difficult to see the diameter that would be the shortest distance between where you are and where you want to be. The blemishes became so bad that she was advised to seek the advice of a dermatologist. During the consultation, the dermatologist told her that there was nothing wrong with her skin, except that she used too much makeup, which was causing her to break out, which was causing her to use too much makeup. The dermatologist said that if she stopped using so much makeup, that her skin would clear up and she wouldn't have to use makeup. "What about my birthmark?" she asked, and the dermatologist replied, "What about it? There's nothing wrong with you. You're beautiful. If anyone has a problem with your birthmark, then that's their problem to deal with. You're going to have that birthmark for the rest of your life. You might as well get used to it." And the girl had nothing to say in response, inadvertently letting the dermatologist have the last word as he turned his back and walked out of the room. She took the summer off of everything and spent a lot of time by herself. She spent as much time as she could inside, and when she went out she would wear a black silk veil hanging from a broad-brimmed hat. Not like a net, more like a sheer black shroud she could swish around inside without anyone seeing in. It was quiet inside, or at least it seemed to be quieter inside of the darkness of the veil. When she came back to school she had clear skin and an unearthly pallor which served to accentuate the presence of her birthmark. The Spanish girls called her bruja, which was Spanish for witch, but they meant no harm in it. It's just what they called her, instinctively reacting to what to them was unusual. What they really meant was phantasma, which is Spanish for ghost girl. Although she wasn't really a ghost, but she might as well have been considering the way she was able to drift through the hallways at school without anyone standing in her way. One year in school she was in a class in which the teacher offered extra credit if the students would pretend to be handicapped for a week, and she decided to be deaf. In her spare time she taught herself sign language and would often pretend she was deaf in public to hear what people would say about her when they thought she couldn't hear what they were saying. When she was in school she would draw imaginary animals that were neither fish nor fowl. That was when she wasn't sleeping between classes. She would often stay up late and read in her room. She liked to imagine herself living like a god above the people in her stories, and managed to convince herself that what was happening in the books was more important than what was happening in real life. When she finally decided what she wanted to do, she decided to be a veterinarian so that she could work with the animals in the zoo, and she decided that she would ask everyone, "Are zebras white with black stripes or black with white stripes?" And when she finally met the man that could answer her question, she would know that she had met the man that she would want to marry. Much to her surprise, becoming a veterinarian is just as, if not more difficult than becoming a doctor, because unlike doctors, veterinarians have to be able to know the inner workings of several different species. But she preserved, and she works with the animals in the zoo, and she always asks everyone if zebras are white with black stripes or black with white stripes, but no one ever seemed to know the answer to her question. Chapter 7. Where Werewolves Come From. One time this girl told my friend that she had fucked a dog. Let me back this up a bit. When she sat down next to him, he said, "Just for shits and giggles, just for the sake of argument, let's both play the devil's advocate and say whatever comes to mind. No judgment, no restraint. Would you? Would you if I asked you to?" It was part of this social experiment he was playing with anyone he met, where he would exercise complete honesty in his interactions and see what he got in return. She said yes, and then she said, "I fucked a dog once." "Pardon me?" he said, "but unless I'm mistaken, you just said that you fucked a dog." She smiled and said, "Yes, I did." He took a sip of his drink, and looked her in the eyes and said, "Continue." "I was watching a house for a friend, and they had this beautiful dog. It was a Rottweiler. It was beautiful. I loved that dog," she said, and paused for emphasis. "One time I was over the house, and it was hot, and it was late, and I was wearing shorts, and I bent over to pick up something, and the dog mounted me and started humping me. It was a big dog, so it knocked me to the floor, and I decided to go with it. I wasn't very popular in school," she said. "So what was it like?" he said, maintaining his composure, but screaming inside of his head. "It wasn't bad," she said. "He was really quite gentle. It was like he was trying not to hurt me." "Weren't you worried about getting pregnant?" he said. "No," she said. "It's not like I was going to get pregnant with puppies. The dog had had all of its shots, and it's not like it was rabid or anything. I think it was just confused and lonely. I was kind of lonely too, I guess." "Is that it?" he asked, and took another sip of his drink. "No," she said. "Whenever they'd leave town, I'd volunteer to watch their house. I might have seemed like I was just a really helpful person, but I really just missed that dog. I still miss that dog," she said, and got up and smiled and walked away. The next time my friend saw me, he was excited beyond belief, and I thought something awful had happened. but he said he couldn't tell me what he had to tell me until we were alone. And we were finally alone, and I asked him what it was that was so important that he couldn't wait to tell me. He began by saying that he was talking to this girl, and she told him something that I wouldn't believe, and I immediately offhandedly replied, "What? Did she fuck a dog or something?" True story. Although I might have disappointed my friend by cock-blocking his story, by thinking of the most outlandishly unbelievable scenario that I could think of at the moment, when all is said and done, I'm just relieved that I finally think I know where werewolves come from.